I'm grateful to be on the land now. I also want to acknowledge, because the land is a really important part of my work, that I work from the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam First Nations, which is also known as Burnaby, BC. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. My background is that I was a graphic novelist and an illustrator for over a decade. For some reason, all of my audience was neurodiverse and trans, which was very interesting because I wasn't neurodiverse or trans. Spoiler alert, yes I was. And in the time working with this community, I heard a lot of stories about healthcare encounters that were really upsetting to me. And I learned a lot about illnesses that were kind of mysterious, a lot of undiagnosed neurodiversity or difficulty getting these diagnoses. So I kind of transitioned into being a biomedical illustrator. When I gained my diagnosis, one of the things that was really important was, well, did you do poorly in school? I sure did. Why don't you try again with this new information? And I did. I went back. I went from someone who dropped out in grade 8 and had to finish in grade 10, had to finish, at an alternative school, failed grade 8 math twice, to having finished calculus and genetics, and it turned out I just needed to look at things a little differently. I needed to work backwards from the answer, not build up to it. So in this capacity, I became a biomedical illustrator, but it still wasn't really hitting what I needed to, which was connecting to community. Which is where I was introduced to the Two Spirit Dry Lab. So if you don't know about the Two Spirit Dry Lab, they're Turtle Island's first healthcare lab. Dry lab just means we work with paper and not with like Bunsen burners. That focuses on Two Spirit communities, health, and experience. Co-PIs Travis Salway, who is my supervisor, and Harlan Pruden, who I happened to write an essay on when I was still in the biomedical side of things, and that it was essentially my introduction to community-based research. And I was like, oh man, heck everything else, we're doing this. I also work with the Reaffirm Collaborative, which is working on researching affirming spaces for Two-Spirit and LGBTQ identities, and was part of the scholarship that pushed forward Bill C-6 to ban conversion therapy in Canada. So what is Two-Spirit? This is a lot of text that I'm not going to read. This is on the CIHR website if you Google what is Two-Spirit. But what Two-Spirit is it is a new term that was coined in the 1990s, August 4th, 1990, which happens to be my birthday. And so this term was to encompass these many gender expressions that different nations have historically. Our ancestors have these expressions, these genders. But as we are finding and reclaiming these, Two-Spirit is the umbrella term on which we all belong under. And it is less of an identity and more of a community organization tool, because we are rejecting this concept of identities. We heard Julia talk about this last night, right? These border wars. Two-Spirit is in some ways a salve to this idea of border wars, because when we are Two-Spirit, we are a role in the community, such as, oops, my brain just went, nope, neurodiverse. So we were often like moderators or facilitators. We were often healers in our communities, but our gender was more about our relation to our community than about our specific identity. And now we're going to talk about neurodiversity. I'm talking about autism and ADHD here, but of course there are other neurodiverse situations like borderline personality disorder or bipolar, which have a lot of commonality. But these are neurobiological processes, sometimes including dysregulation and nervous system regulation. Your nervous system is your fight or flight system, that are often misunderstood as a mental illness or a behavioral deficit. And what I really want to challenge is this idea of a behavioral deficit. So in Canada, the only federally funded intervention for autism, which is why I'm kind of highlighting autism specifically, is called Applied Behavioral Analysis. So ABA was actually developed with and alongside and based off of conversion therapy. And it has been called conversion therapy for autistic people. There is a strong association with PTSD. Jake Pine's work has looked at this. And what I really want to highlight is on this graph here, in this 2020 study, Crompton found, so we took a bunch of autistic people and we put them together and we wanted to see if information transfer would happen as This is a way to operationalize understanding social skills. So could they communicate, essentially, right? Autism is a behavioral deficit. Can autistic people communicate? They can communicate just as well as allistic or non-autistic people. And the only problem happens when you introduce a non-autistic person to the autistic group. They essentially become autistic. So now we have to question this idea of a social deficit. It's a different way of being social, not a wrong way of being social. So in wanting to explore the experiences, especially of two-spirit and autistic and neurodiverse people, I joined the Unicorn Survey. So the Unicorn Study was rolled out last summer for youth ages 15 to 29, really comprehensive to look at where their identities, whether trans or even cis identities or other queer identities, were being affirmed or denied in healthcare spaces, in sports spaces, in all kinds of spaces. So we hit our goal of over 4,000 respondents for the Unicorn. 881 of those were Indigenous, 159 of those were Two-Spirit, and are you ready for this? 78% of our Two-Spirit respondents self-identified as neurodiverse, which compared to 60% of the entire survey. So of those, 28% report ADHD, 21% report autism, which are tenfold what we would expect, which is very exciting. I'm going to raise the fact here that I think this is something to celebrate. I think this is a direction that we can be proud of. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about two-spirit-eyed seeing, which is a concept we're currently developing at the Dry Lab. You may be familiar with Elder Albert Marshall's two-eyed seeing, which is the idea of holding Indigenous wisdom and, because not all things colonial are terrible. Sometimes we like statistics. And holding those both in places of honor and seeing how we can use those tools to help our population. So when we're looking at two-spirit-eyed seeing, we're looking at adding the lessons we learn from our two-spirit relatives and their role in society and how inclusion sort of works for us and the way that we are invited and celebrated, and we are now going to apply that to neurodiversity to see where in our communities can we thrive. Something that really struck me was I was speaking with a First Nations woman that is another scholar, Brittany Bingham, and her first response was, I don't think there's going to be a word for autism because we don't see that as a difference or a deficit. And I thought that was really striking. So part of the Unicorn Study was seeing where these people who are neurodiverse and who are two-spirit are being affirmed, because I believe that enough research has been done on where we are suffering. We know where we are suffering, right? As a community, it's time to look at where we can thrive as a solution to that. Over and over again, we see talking about people. Again, this is just the neurodiverse population. So where they're feeling affirmed, friends, family, people, not what you would expect from a group where we are anticipating a social deficit. They are being supported. They are thriving. One story, because I have a little extra time I am going to share, was of a teen who is two-spirit who was on the football team, frightening heteronormative place to be, right? Who was terrified and came out. And their team put them on their shoulders and threw them a parade. And I just wanted to cry when I read this story. It was so beautiful. Over and over, people were being celebrated. So I want to come back. Again, I'm focusing on autism, but my research will be extending to other kinds of neurodiversity and look at what is wrong with the colonial definition of autism. So in the DSM-5, our favorite book, autism is defined by persistent deficits in social communication. Again, we know that autistic people can communicate with each other just fine. I am also, something I'm exploring is the fact that autistic people don't seem to experience those deficits in Indigenous spaces. I know I certainly don't feel those deficits in Indigenous spaces in the same way I do in colonial spaces. Lack of eye contact. How terrible, they're looking somewhere else. Difficulties adjusting behavior to different social contexts. Autistic people are often known to be rigid or also to have a strong sense of justice. Excessive aversion or interest in sensory stimuli. This is where the two-spirit I'd seen comes in. Neurodiverse people, not just autistic people, often other kinds of neurodiverse people, do have sensory differences, which are easy to accommodate once we understand them, right? We might need to have earphones. We might need quiet spaces. So the solution, applied behavioral analysis, is to change behaviors, to enforce social norms, not to change the sensory environment, not to support the person, but to actually change the generally child so that they are no longer autistic. Whereas in Cree, we see this word pitoye hitem, they think differently. It is important for me to note at this time that differently in an Indigenous context is not stigmatized. This is not differently in a transgressive way. This is different in an ecosystem way, and we need all kinds. So inclusion is no longer contingent on social performance, right? That is very anthropocentric or human-centered to think that your value to society is contingent on your ability to interact with other people in the way that they find palatable. And the problem is stigma and lack of access to appropriate care. So my sort of theory of autism is that we're kind of like nocturnal pollinators. This is how I conceptualize it. We're kind of misrepresented. We can thrive in an accommodating environment. Our communication styles are unique. If you give a bat sunglasses, it's not going to be able to communicate with a bird, but it's still doing important work in its environment. However, that's just my opinion. So the next step is to work with the Amplify team, which is a arts-based research group working with the two-spirit population to see how we are altogether, how we are conceiving ourselves as neurodiverse people, what we need, and to do that using arts-based methods. So the reason I'm looking at arts-based methods, I am also doing epidemiological analysis, but for my research, we are using arts-based methods because we want to empower people to kind of research us back, to use this space to ask their questions of us so that I'm not asking the questions. I'm giving them a space. I'm saying, what do you think? Join me in this research. And also because I'm working with neurodiverse people, this gives people who might be experiencing emotional dysregulation new tools to cope and to process, or maybe tools they're already used to using. It allows autistic people, again, I was an illustrator for many years, this has been my approach, to have sort of a roundabout way of communication that is not contingent on their verbal ability. And it lets us work together, which is really important, and it creates safety and connection. I've run this workshop twice, and the results have been beyond my wildest dreams. Another power of the workshop is, again, bringing neurodiverse people together. I suspect that this autistic people communicating with autistic people extends because anyone who's neurodiverse knows that all our friends are as well, but not necessarily the same flavor of neurodiverse, right? Lots of my friends have bipolar, have ADHD, and we're still able to communicate and understand each other. So yeah, this was my research. I'm excited about it. We're just starting out. Miigwech, Marcy, thank you so much. It has been incredible to be in this space with other people who have self-identified to me as neurodiverse. Of course, so many of us are trans, and some of us are two-spirit, and yeah, it's been an amazing experience. So thank you very much.